The transport ship descended through clouds of purple and gold as Commander Marcus. Cole pressed his face against the observation window, like a child seeing snow for the first time. He had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, and now the crystal towers of Valarith Prime rose before him like frozen music made solid and real. Humanity had only discovered faster than light travel 15 years ago, and in that short time, they had learned a terrible truth. The galaxy was old and humanity was very, very young. The Valari had watched the stars for 10,000 years before humans learned to make fire, and their empire stretched across 100 worlds, while Earth still argued about borders and flags. Marcus took a deep breath and straightened his uniform as the ship touched down on a landing platform made of something that looked like glass but sang with a soft hum when weight pressed. Against it was the first human ambassador to the Valari throne world and every person on Earth. Watched through the cameras mounted on his shoulders. No pressure at all, he thought to himself with grim humor. Welcoming party waited at the edge of the platform, and Marcus felt his heart stumble when he saw her for the first time. Princess Serafini Val Cathara stood at the front of the group, and she was unlike anything he had ever imagined. Skin held the pale blue shimmer of moonlight on water, and her eyes were silver pools that seemed to hold entire galaxies within them. She was tall and slender, with hair that flowed like liquid starlight down her back, and when she smiled, Marcus forgot every word of the carefully prepared speech he had memorized. "Commander Cole," she said, and her voice reminded him of wind chimes in a summer breeze. "Welcome to Valarith Prime, and welcome to the family of civilized worlds." Marcus managed to bow without falling over, which he counted as a victory. "Thank you, Princess," he replied. "Humanity is honored by your hospitality." She laughed, and the sound made his chest feel warm in a way he did not understand. "So formal," she said. "We shall have to teach you to relax among friends." Over the following weeks, Seraphine became his guide and his teacher. She showed him the crystal gardens where flowers made of living light bloomed and died in cycles that matched the distant pulse of their sun. She walked with him through the ancient libraries where knowledge older than human civilization waited in glowing spheres that whispered secrets when touched. She asked him endless questions about Earth, and about humans, and about the strange warmth that seemed to burn in human hearts. "You feel everything so deeply," she observed one evening as they watched the twin moons rise over the silver sea. "Joy and sorrow and love and anger all burning inside you at once, and yet you do not shatter from the intensity." Marcus shrugged and tried not to notice how close she stood to him. "We are a young species," he said. "Maybe we have not learned to control our feelings yet." Seraphine shook her head, and her hair caught the moonlight in ways that made his breath catch. "No," she said softly. "I think perhaps you have learned something we have forgotten." She reached out and placed her hand over his heart, and Marcus felt the universe grow very still and very quiet. "What is this warmth?" she whispered. "This fire that burns without consuming." "I think," Marcus said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "I think it might be hope." She looked up at him with those silver eyes, and Marcus saw something flicker in their depths. He did not know that she was searching for something specific, and he did not know that every question she asked served a purpose. Beyond curiosity, Queen Vilith had given her daughter a mission before the human arrived. Humanity had survived something called the Silence, and no young species had ever done that before. The Silence was a quarantine that the elder races placed around developing worlds, and it was designed to prevent young civilizations from reaching the stars before they were ready. But somehow humanity had broken through, and the Queen wanted to know how the princess was to get close to the human ambassador and learn his secrets by whatever means necessary. Seraphine had accepted the mission without question because she was a princess of the Valari and duty came before all else. But as the weeks turned into months, she found herself caught in something she had not expected. The human was nothing like the reports had suggested. He was kind where she expected aggression and curious, where she expected fear and warm, where she expected the cold calculation of a species fighting for survival. He made her laugh with stories of his childhood on a small farm in a place called Kansas, where the sky stretched forever and the wheat turned gold in the autumn sun. He shared his fears with her, openly admitting that he often felt small and inadequate when compared to the ancient wisdom of the Yomtur. Valaria had trusted her completely, and that trust was like a knife in her heart. One night, after they had walked for hours through the glowing forest that surrounded the capital city, Marcus stopped and turned to face her. "I need to tell you something," he said, and his voice trembled slightly. "I know this is probably foolish, and I know that a human and a Valari could never truly be together, but I cannot keep this inside anymore." Seraphine felt her heart racing in a way it had never raced before. "Marcus," she said, and she meant to stop him before he said words that could not be unsaid, but he was already speaking, and his words fell like rain on dry soil. "I love you, Seraphine," he said. "I have loved you since the first moment I saw you standing on that platform, and every day since then has only made me love you more." She should have used this moment to extract more information. She should have played the part of the grateful princess and manipulated his confession into an opportunity for her mission. Instead, she found herself stepping forward and pressing her lips against his in a kiss that tasted like starlight and regret. The human wrapped his arms around her and held her like she was the most precious thing in the universe, and Seraphine felt tears streaming down her face. She had been sent to deceive him, but somewhere along the way she had deceived herself. She loved him too, and that love was a betrayal of everything she had been raised to believe. High above them, in the Fez crystal towers of the palace, Queen Valith watched through surveillance feeds and smiled. Daughter had done well, and soon humanity would pay the price for daring to reach beyond their station. The queen did not notice the tears on her daughter's face, and she did not understand that the game had become something far more complicated than she had planned. The Galactic Conclave chamber stretched before Marcus like a cathedral made of living crystal and light representatives from 100 species sat in tiered rows that rose toward a ceiling so high it seemed to touch the stars themselves. Marcus stood in the human delegation box with his small team of diplomats and scientists, and he felt very small and very young. The Valari Queen rose from her throne at the center of the chamber, and her voice carried through the vast space like thunder. Rolling across mountains, fellow members of the conclave, Queen Valith announced, "We bring evidence of a grave crime against galactic law, and we demand justice for all civilized peoples." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine even before the holographic displays flickered to life around the chamber. Images appeared in the air, showing documents and recordings and technical specifications that Marcus recognized immediately. They were his reports and his private communications and his personal observations, meant only for the eyes of Earth's government. "The humans have developed Ember technology," the Queen declared, and gasps echoed through the chamber like waves crashing against rocks. This unstable and dangerous energy source was banned by the Elder races 10,000 years ago, and the humans have been hiding it from us since their first contact with our civilization. Marcus watched in horror as his own words scrolled across the displays, twisted and edited to support accusations he had never made. He saw recordings of his conversations with Seraphine spliced together to create confessions of crimes humanity had never committed. "The evidence was gathered by our own Princess Seraphine," the Queen continued, "who bravely sacrificed her honor to infiltrate the confidence of the human ambassador." The chamber doors opened and Seraphine walked in wearing formal robes of state that made her look like a statue carved from ice. She did not look at Marcus as she took her place beside her mother. She did not meet his eyes as the Queen praised her loyalty and her dedication to the safety of the galaxy. Marcus felt something break inside his chest, and it was not his heart, because that had already shattered the moment he saw his private words. displayed for the entire galaxy to see. It was his trust that broke, and his faith in the goodness he had believed he found among the stars. Conclave voted to impose sanctions on humanity, and the decision was nearly unanimous. Earth would be cut off from galactic trade, and human ships would be forbidden from traveling beyond their own solar system. There was talk of military intervention to neutralize the supposed Ember threat, and several species volunteered to lead the assault. Marcus stood silent through all of it because there was nothing he could say that would change anything. When the session finally ended and the delegates began to file out, Marcus walked through the crystal corridors of the conclave building toward the gardens, where he and Seraphine had spent so many evenings together. He was not surprised when he found her waiting for him there. She stood among the flowers of light with her hands clasped before her, and her silver eyes were wet with tears. She refused to let fall. Marcus, she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. I need to explain. He stopped several feet away from her, and he did not close the distance between them. Explain what? He asked, and his voice was calm and cold in a way that made her flinch. Explain how you used every moment we spent together to gather information for your mother's schemes. Or explain how you took my love and turned it into a weapon against my entire species. Seraphine shook her head, and a single tear escaped to run down her pale blue cheek. It started as a mission, she admitted. My mother ordered me to get close to you and learn how humanity survived the silence. But Marcus, you have to believe me when I say that everything changed. She stepped toward him with her hand reaching out to touch his face. I fell in love with you, she said. For the first time in my life, I felt something real and true, and I know I should have told you everything, but I was afraid. Marcus looked at her hand hovering near his cheek, and he remembered all the times that hand had touched him with what he thought was tenderness. Was any of it real? He asked. Seraphine hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, Marcus found his answer. I loved you, she said finally. By the end, it was all real, and I wanted to warn you, but my mother moved faster than I expected, and I was trapped between my duty and my heart. Marcus nodded slowly, and he took a step backward away from her reaching hand. You were an assignment, he said, and the words tasted like ash in his mouth. Everything you said and everything you did was designed to make me trust you, so you could betray that trust when the time was right. No, Seraphine protested. Marcus, please, you have to understand. I understand perfectly, he interrupted. You had a choice between telling me the truth and playing your part in your mother's game. And you chose the game. He turned to look out at the crystal towers of the city where he had once believed he might find a future worth fighting for. I trusted you with everything, he said quietly. I told you things I have never told anyone, and you used it all to condemn my people to isolation and possibly destruction. Seraphine was crying openly now, and her tears caught the light of the glowing flowers like diamonds falling from her eyes. I never wanted this, she sobbed. I tried to convince my mother that humans were not a threat, but she would not listen, and I was not brave enough to defy her openly. Marcus turned back to face her one last time. I hope it was worth it, princess, he said, and his voice carried no anger, only a sadness that seemed to stretch all the way back to Earth. I hope whatever your mother gains from destroying humanity is worth the price you paid. He walked past her without touching her, and he did not look back when she called his name from the shadows of the upper terrace. Queen Valeth watched the scene unfold with cold satisfaction. She had expected the human to rage and threaten and make a spectacle of himself that would justify even harsher measures against his species. Instead, he walked away with his spine straight and his head held high and his dignity wrapped around him like armor. The queen had won, and humanity would pay for their crimes against Galactic Lob. As she watched Marcus Cole disappear into the evening shadows, something stirred in her chest that she did not recognize. It felt almost like doubt. She dismissed the feeling as irrelevant. Because she was the queen of the Valari, and she did not make. Mistake Seraphine fell to her knees among the flowers of light and wept for the love she had destroyed. She did not see her mother watching from above, and she did not know that the queen was already planning the next phase of her campaign against humanity. All she knew was that Marcus was gone, and he had taken the warmth from her heart with him. Flowers around her continued to bloom and die in their endless cycle, completely indifferent to the sorrow of a princess who had learned too late that some things cannot be taken back. The galaxy waited for humanity to break. Every species that had ever faced the wrath of the Valari knew what came next, and they expected to watch another young civilization crumble under the weight of sanctions and isolation. The Valari ambassador to Earth sent daily reports back to Queen Valith, describing the chaos and panic he expected to find among the frightened humans. But his reports grew increasingly confused as the weeks passed. There was no chaos, and there was no panic. There was only work factories that had stood idle for years roared back to life, running triple shifts as workers streamed in with determination written on their faces. Scientists disappeared into underground research facilities and emerged weeks later with eyes red from lack of sleep but burning with purpose. Politicians who had spent years fighting each other suddenly found common ground, and legislation that once took months to pass moved through governments in days the people of Earth did not riot in the streets or demand that their leaders surrender to the galactic powers. Instead, they organized neighborhoods, formed support networks, and shared resources and skill schools, added new courses on engineering and physics and chemistry taught by retired scientists who came out of retirement because their planet needed them. Children learned to dream of the stars, again, not with fear, but with the stubborn hope that had carried humanity through ice ages and plagues and wars. The Valari ambassador requested an audience with the Secretary General of the United Nations, and he asked directly what humanity was planning. The Secretary General smiled and offered him tea. "We are doing what humans have always done when faced with extinction," she said. "We are refusing to accept it." 6 months after the sanctions were imposed, humanity made their move. Every communication channel in the galaxy suddenly carried the same broadcast, and the face that appeared on every screen was one that many species recognized. Marcus Cole stood before the United Nations General Assembly, but his words were meant for every being in the galaxy who had ears to hear. "My name is Marcus Cole," he said, and his voice was steady and calm. 6 months ago, I stood accused of helping my species develop a forbidden technology, and I was told that my trust in those I loved had been used to condemn my entire planet. He paused, and the galaxy held its breath. "Today I stand before you to tell the truth." The screens behind him flickered to life, showing documents and recordings and technical specifications that told a very different story than the one the Valari had presented. "Ember technology is not a weapon," Marcus continued. "It is a clean and sustainable energy source that humanity developed from first principles over decades of research, and it is the reason we survived the silence." More images appeared showing the history of the silence and the quarantine that the elder races had placed around developing worlds. The silence was not designed to protect young species, Marcus revealed. It was designed to trap them in their own solar systems until they either destroyed themselves or became too weak to resist absorption into the existing power structures. Gasps echoed across the galaxy as species who had always accepted the silence as benevolent protection began to question what they had been told. Humanity broke the silence not through aggression or theft, but through innovation. Marcus said, "We developed our own faster-than-light travel, and our own energy systems, and our own solutions to the problems of space travel." He looked directly into the camera with eyes that had seen betrayal and heartbreak but still burned with conviction, and the Valari could not allow that because Ember technology threatens the monopoly they have held over galactic power distribution for 10,000 years. The screens showed evidence that the Valari had suppressed similar technologies in other species for millennia, destroying civilizations that came too close to independence and absorbing those that submitted to their control. This is not about protecting the galaxy from a dangerous technology, Marcus declared. This is about one empire trying to maintain its grip on power by crushing anyone who dares to find their own path to the stars. He held up a data crystal that glowed with soft golden light. This crystal contains everything, he said. All of our research and all of our designs and all of the knowledge we have gained about Ember technology, and we are giving it away freely to any species that wants it. The galaxy erupted in confusion and disbelief. No species had ever shared technology so openly and so freely, and many assumed it must be a trick or a trap. But as researchers across 100 worlds analyzed the data, they found exactly what Marcus had promised: clean energy that could power civilizations without the need for Valari distribution networks, freedom from dependence on an empire that had controlled the flow of power for longer than most species could remember. Marcus ended his broadcast with words that would be remembered for generations. "We trusted the Valari," he said, "and they used that trust against us, so let me be clear about something." He leaned forward, and his eyes seemed to look directly at every being watching across the vast distances of space. "Humanity does not beg, and we do not break, and we do not forget." He straightened, and his voice softened just slightly. "But we also do not seek revenge because we are too busy building something better, and anyone who wants to build with us is welcome." The broadcast ended, and the galaxy would never be the same. Queen Valeth watched the recording in her private chambers with hands that trembled slightly against the arms of her throne. The human had not attacked them or threatened them or demanded vengeance. He had simply told the truth and offered to share everything humanity had learned. And somehow that was more devastating than any weapon could ever be. Whispers began almost immediately as species that had been loyal to the Valari for centuries started asking questions they had never dared to ask before. The Queen realized too late that she had badly underestimated these young beings from the small blue world. They were not children to be guided or threats to be eliminated. They were something new and something dangerous, and something that her empire might not survive. The age of Valari dominance was ending, and the age of humanity was just beginning. The Valari Empire had stood for 10,000 years, but it took less than 2 years to begin crumbling into dust. Species that had been client states and loyal vassals for centuries suddenly demanded independence and access to the Ember technology that humanity had shared freely with the galaxy trade alliances that had funneled wealth into. Valari coffers for generations were dissolved overnight as planets built their own power systems and freed themselves from dependence on the Empire's galactic conclave that had once been a rubber stamp for Valari policies became a battleground where Queen Valeth faced accusations and demands from beings who had once bowed before her throne. "You lied to us," the representative from the Corthan collective shouted across the chamber. "You suppressed technologies that could have saved millions of our people from poverty and suffering. You used the silence to trap developing worlds in cages of your own design," the Meridian ambassador added. "How many civilizations died because you decided they were threats to your power?" Queen Valeth sat rigid on her throne and tried to project the cold authority that had silenced her enemies for 1,000 years. But the mask was cracking, and everyone could see the fear underneath. Her own conclave turned against her, and the vote of no confidence passed by a margin that would have been unthinkable. Just 2 years earlier, the Queen was not removed from power immediately, but her authority was stripped away piece by piece as reformers and rebels dismantled the structures of control she had spent her entire reign building. Through it all, Seraphine watched in silence from the shadows of the palace. She had not spoken to her mother since the day Marcus walked away from her in the Crystal Gardens, and she had not spoken to Marcus since the broadcast that changed the galaxy. But she followed the news from Earth obsessively, and she watched recordings of his speeches and his interviews until she had memorized every word. He never mentioned her by name, but she could see the sadness in his eyes when interviewers asked about his time on Valarith Prime. She knew that sadness because she carried the same weight in her own heart. One night she made a decision that terrified her more than anything she had ever done. She boarded a ship in secret and traveled to Earth alone and unannounced. Journey took 3 weeks, and she spent every moment rehearsing what she would say when she saw him again. When her ship landed at the diplomatic port in Geneva, she found human security officers waiting for her on the platform. They did not arrest her or threaten her, but they did not smile either. Commander Cole has agreed to meet with you, the lead officer said, one time and one time only, so I suggest you make it count. They led her through streets filled with humans who stopped and stared at the Valari princess walking among them. She expected hatred in their eyes, but what she saw was worse. She saw pity. Marcus was waiting for her in a small conference room with plain walls and simple furniture that seemed almost primitive compared to the crystal splendor of Valarith Prime. He looked older than she remembered, with lines around his eyes that had not been there before, and gray beginning to show at his temples. But his eyes were the same, and when they met hers, Seraphine felt her heart break all over again. Seraphine, he said, and his voice was carefully neutral. Thank you for making the journey. She wanted to run to him and throw her arms around him and beg him to forgive her. Instead, she stood perfectly still with her hands clasped before her, the way she had been taught since childhood. Marcus, she said, and her voice trembled despite her best efforts. I came to explain and to apologize and to warn you. He nodded and gestured for her to sit in one of the simple chairs. Explain then. She sat and tried to gather her thoughts into words that could possibly convey the depth of her regret. I loved you, she said finally. I know you have no reason to believe me, but by the end everything I felt for you was real. Marcus watched her with an expression she could not read. My mother ordered me to get close to you and learn your secrets. Seraphine continued, and I followed those orders because I was raised to believe that duty to the Empire was more important than anything else. She looked down at her hands and saw that they were shaking. But you changed something in me, Marcus. And for the first time in my life, I wanted to be more than just a tool of my mother's ambitions. She looked up and met his eyes with desperate honesty. I should have told you the truth, and I should have warned you about what my mother was planning. But I was a coward, and I was afraid of losing you. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. And I lost you anyway, so I suppose that is what I deserved. Marcus sat in silence for a long moment, and Seraphine felt every second stretch into eternity, I believe. You, he said finally, and she felt hope flutter in her chest like a wounded bird trying to fly, but his next words crushed that hope before it could take wing. I believe that by the end you loved me, he said, but you chose your empire over honesty. And you chose manipulation over trust, and that choice had consequences that neither of us can undo. Seraphine nodded, and tears began to fall down her cheeks. I know, she whispered. I know, and I'm so sorry. Marcus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city where humans went about their daily lives, unaware of the conversation happening above them. You said you came to warn me, he said. Warn me about what? Seraphine wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself. There are factions among the Valari who blame humanity for the fall of the Empire, she said. They are planning assassination attempts against you and other human leaders. Marcus nodded without turning around. We know, he said. Our intelligence services are quite good. Then you know you are in danger. He turned back to face her with something almost like a smile on his lips. I have been in danger since the moment I set foot on your world, princess, and I have learned to live with it. He walked toward her and stopped just close enough that she could smell the scent she remembered from nights spent in his arms. Go home, Seraphine, he said softly. Tell your mother that humanity sends no assassins and no fleets and no revenge because we are too busy building something better." She looked up at him with all the love she still felt burning in her silver eyes. "Is there nothing I can do to make this right?" she asked. Marcus reached out and touched her cheek with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "Some things cannot be undone," he said. "But you can learn from this, and you can choose differently next time." He dropped his hand and stepped back. "That is not love, Seraphine," he said. "What you offered me on Valarth Prime was not love, because love requires honesty and trust and the courage to choose the person you love over everything else." He walked to the door and opened it. "What you gave me was ownership dressed up in pretty words, and I deserve better than that." Seraphine stood on trembling legs and walked past him into the hallway, stopped at the threshold, and looked back one last time. "I will always love you, Marcus," she said. He nodded, and his eyes held sadness, but also something that might have been peace. "I know," he said, "and I hope someday you find someone worthy of that love." He closed the door, and Seraphine walked away carrying the weight of everything she had lost. When she returned to Valarith Prime and reported to her mother, the Queen listened in silence that stretched longer than any words could fill. The human had not gloated or demanded concessions or used the opportunity to strike at a weakened empire. He had simply forgiven and moved on, and somehow that hurt more than any revenge could have. Queen Valarith sat alone in her throne room after her daughter left, and for the first time in her 1,000-year reign, she felt truly and completely small. 10 years had passed since Marcus Cole stood before the United Nations and changed the galaxy forever. Universe looked very different now. Where once the Valari Empire had ruled with cold authority and ancient power, now stood the Galactic Coalition. For open progress, 57 species had joined the coalition, and more applied for membership. Every year drawn by the promise of shared technology and mutual respect that humanity had championed since their first days among the stars. Amber technology had spread to every corner of known space, and worlds that had once depended on Valari power networks now generated their own clean energy civilizations that had been locked in poverty for generations began to flourish as the chains of artificial scarcity fell away, and at the center of it all stood humanity, not as conquerors or rulers, but as partners and builders and dreamers who refused to let the darkness of the past define the brightness of the future. Marcus Cole served as Earth's Secretary of Interstellar Affairs, and his hair had gone fully gray in the years since Valarith Prime. He never married. Some said he had given that part of himself away on a distant world and never gotten it back, and they were not entirely wrong. But he did not live in bitterness or regret. Instead, he poured everything he had into building the galaxy he had dreamed of during those long nights in the Crystal Gardens when he still believed that love could bridge any divide. The Valari Empire was gone, now replaced by a collection of independent worlds struggling to find their place in a galaxy that no longer feared or obeyed them. Queen Valarith had been deposed by her own council 3 years after the fall, and she lived now in exile on a small moon at the edge of former Valari space. She had requested an audience with the human government many times over the years, and each time she had been politely refused until today. Marcus stood in his office in Geneva, looking out at the city that had become the unofficial capital of human diplomacy. His assistant appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely concealed amazement. "Sir, the former Valari Queen is here, and she is asking to see you personally." Marcus nodded slowly, and he was surprised to find that he felt no anger or satisfaction at the news, only a quiet curiosity about what the old monarch could possibly want after all these years. "Send her in." Queen Valarith walked into the office with none of the majesty she had once commanded. She wore simple robes instead of royal vestments, and her silver hair hung loose instead of being styled in the elaborate patterns of Valari. Nobility, she looked old in a way that Marcus had never seen before, and he realized that the weight of her failures had aged her more than the centuries ever could. "Secretary Cole," she said, and her voice was soft and uncertain. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." Marcus gestured to a chair, and the former queen sat with visible relief as if standing. "It had become difficult for her, Your Majesty," he said, and he used the title out of courtesy rather than acknowledgement of any remaining authority. "It has been a long time." Valeth nodded, and her eyes studied his face with an intensity that reminded him of her daughter. "I underestimated your kind," she said simply. "I thought you were children playing at civilization, and I believed that crushing you would be as easy as it had been with so many species before." She looked down at her hands, which were thin and spotted with age. "I was wrong, and my empire paid the price for my arrogance." Marcus sat back in his chair and waited for her to continue. "I did not come here to make excuses," Valeth said. "There are no excuses for what I did, and I will carry the weight of my choices until the day I die." She looked up and met his eyes with something that might have been humility. "I came to ask what happens to my people now." Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "That depends on them," he said. "The coalition does not conquer or rule, and we do not punish entire species for the crimes of their leaders." He leaned forward with his hands clasped on the desk. "The Valari worlds are welcome to join the coalition if they choose, and we will share our technology and our resources with them as freely as we share with everyone else." Valeth shook her head slowly, as if she could not quite believe what she was hearing. "After everything I did to your people, you would welcome yours as equals?" "Yes," Marcus said simply. "Why?" It was the question that had haunted the galaxy for a decade, and Marcus answered it the same way he always did. "Because revenge is easy, but building something better is hard, and we chose the hard path. Because it was the right thing to do." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the humans and aliens moving through the streets below in peaceful coexistence. "My people have a saying," he continued. "We judge ourselves by our best intentions, but we judge others by their worst actions, and that is not fair." He turned back to face the former queen. "You did terrible things, and those things had consequences that you will have to live with, but that does not mean your people deserve to suffer forever." Valeth sat in stunned silence for a long moment. "I have lived for over 1,000 years, she said finally, "and I have never met anyone quite like you humans." Marcus smiled, and it was a genuine smile without bitterness or irony. "We are emotional, and we feel everything too deeply, and we break all the time." He extended his hand toward her in the human gesture of greeting and peace. "But we also know how to heal, and we are willing to help others heal if they want our help." Valeth stared at his hand for a long time, and Marcus could see the struggle in her silver eyes. 1,000 years of pride and power and certainty warred against the simple truth that she had been wrong about everything. Finally, slowly, she reached out and took his hand. Her grip was weak and her skin was cool, but the gesture meant more than any treaty or declaration could have. "I do not understand how you can offer this," she admitted. "You do not have to understand," Marcus replied. "You just have to accept." He released her hand and stepped back. "The coalition is not perfect, and we make mistakes all the time, but we try to be better than we were yesterday, and we invite everyone else to try with us." Valeth stood, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she bowed before another being, not a bow of defeat or submission, but a bow of respect. "Thank you, Secretary Cole," she said, "for showing me that there was another way." Marcus nodded and walked her to the door. "Your daughter," he said quietly. "How is she?" Valeth paused with her hand on the doorframe. "She rules the Valari homeworld now," she said, "and she has spent the past decade trying to undo the damage I caused." She looked at Marcus with eyes that held something like hope. "She still loves you, and I think she always will." Marcus nodded, and his eyes held sadness but also peace. "Tell her that I wish her well," he said. and tell her that I have forgiven her, because carrying anger is too heavy a burden for anyone to bear. Valeth left, and Marcus stood alone in his office, looking out at the stars that humanity had once only dreamed of reaching across. The galaxy species watched and wondered at these strange beings from the small blue world. The humans had been betrayed and nearly destroyed, and they had answered cruelty with construction. They had met deception with truth and hatred with an open hand. Silence that had trapped young civilizations for millennia was broken forever, and humanity had shattered it not with weapons or wars, but with the one thing that no empire could ever suppress: hope. And in the crystal towers of a distant world, a princess who had once been a spy sat on a throne she never wanted and watched the stars with silver eyes full of tears. She had lost the man she loved through her own choices, and that loss would stay with her forever. But that she could see what he was building across the galaxy, and she could honor his memory by helping to build it too. The age of empires was over. The age of cooperation had begun, and somewhere in the vast darkness between the stars, a small blue world continued to spin, carrying the dreams of a species that had learned the hardest lesson of all, that the strongest power in the universe was not force or fear or control. It was the simple, stubborn refusal to give up on each other. And humans would never stop believing in that power, no matter how many times the galaxy tried to teach them otherwise.